Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. Last night we got the single biggest Warzone weapon tuning update in history. We had like 35 or 40 weapons that were adjusted, so many buffs, so many different nerfs to a ton of different weapons, Cold War, Modern Warfare, you name it. And of course, after we see huge weapon tuning updates like this, usually at the start of the season and also in the mid-season updates, we go ahead and we look at our giant ranking list of every single weapon in the game, all the primaries, all the secondaries. I think we're up to well over 100 weapons at this point on said list. And we go ahead and we see what is meta, what is competitive, viable, below average, so on and so forth. And that is exactly what we're doing here today after the reloaded update or the mid-season update for season 4. So as we go through it all, if you guys enjoy the video at any point, let me know by dropping a like on it, would be seriously appreciated. And of course, if you are new to the channel, something like 57% of you guys watching aren't already subscribed. So if you want to stay up to date with everything going on in COD, news, updates, loadouts, all sorts of stuff like that, it is all right here. So feel free to subscribe with your notifications turned on. Also, quick announcement, starting on Friday, my G Fuel discount code WhosImmortal is going to get you 30% off everything on the site. Tubs, shaker cups, starter packs, you name it, code WhosImmortal has got you covered there. Alrighty, I've got my handy dandy list of all the various weapon changes, not the exact specifics to say, you know, hey, this was nerfed by 0.1 to the headshot multiplier and whatnot, but we have the general basic nerfs for all the weapons, and of course, we've got our tier list as well. First things first though, we do have the Ots9 Smg to rank. And this thing is actually surprisingly good. I think it's a very easy choice for the time being. We got to scroll all the way up though, and this thing is definitely very competitive. Honestly, it is too early to say whether or not this is top meta, but it is one of the best SMGs in the game. The TTK is actually very, very good. Really, its only drawback is the smaller magazine. That's not super ideal. But outside of that, its other stats are very impressive, and competitive is an easy choice for it. Also, I should preface everything. This is just a rough list. Obviously, the update is very, very new. I've tried my best to go in and test out some of the major changes with certain weapons and see how certain weapons feel. But at the end of the day, this is a rough list. Things will change and things, might feel a bit different. So take that for what it's worth. This isn't a 100% accurate list by any means whatsoever, but let's start off with the changes here. First up, we've got the Cold War AK-47. This received a nerf to the damage multipliers, and previously, the Cold War AK-47 that we have here was one of the best rifles in the game. That said, the multipliers are not the biggest factor in a weapon's, ability to be really, really good. Damage is obviously the first initial one, and then you have the damage multipliers. So long as the actual initial damage is still very strong, the weapon is still going to be pretty consistent overall. And honestly, I do think the AK-47 still stays in competitive. It's just going to be slightly less dominant than it was before. But considering so many other weapons also got nerfs, really, there's no reason for it to change out of the competitive category. Now, the Modern Warfare AK-47 also got a nerf for some reason. I'm not sure why, but they also nerfed the damage multiplier on this. And currently it's inviolable, and really the same deal as on the other AK-47. There's not really a huge reason to change it here, but at the same time, there's really also not a huge reason to use this in the current meta. It's a decent gun, and that's why it's inviolable, but in the grand scheme of things, you got a lot of better options compared to the Modern Warfare AK. Now, the C58 also got a pretty significant nerf to its damage range, and then also to its damage multipliers, and then the recoil was also bumped up a bit as well, so the recoil won't be as easy as before. Again though, that is just the multipliers. The core damage is still going to be very, very competitive. This and the AK-47 were the two best rifles in terms of overall TTK prior to this update, and despite the range nerf and despite the multiplier nerf, I still do think the C58 is going to be one of the best rifles in the game. Probably the top 1, 2, or 3 choices, I would say, just based off of these nerfs and based off of how it felt in game when I was using it. You do have to manage the recoil a bit more. So like, for instance, the 4x setup that we talked about the other day is going to be a bit more helpful because that recoil reduction. You're going to have to work a little bit more to get long range kills with it, but overall, it is still a powerhouse. It is still a beast. Now, the AMX got a buff and a nerf to its multipliers. One got a buff, one got a nerf, so that sort of just counteracts. It's still one of the best rifles. By far, I would say probably the best Modern Warfare rifle. It stays in competitive. Then after that, we've got the Pharah. This was the most popular weapon going into this update, and it got some pretty significant nerfs. The damage was nerfed, and so was the recoil. And the Pharah previously was not the strongest weapon in the game. It was just super easy to use, and that's why it was so popular and so meta, you could say, because it just had no recoil. It was so easy to land shots, and the TTK was decent enough that it was able to compete. Now, though, that damage decrease, that's actually a pretty significant drawback, but at the same time, it's still incredibly easy to use. Yes, they nerfed the recoil again. no, it's not impossible to use. Most of these weapons in COD, let's be honest, don't really have hard recoil. This is a tough choice for me though, because I don't think it is bad enough to be just viable, but it's definitely not top tier competitive anymore. Obviously before, you could even make an argument for it being top meta because it was just so easy to use and so easy to do well with. So I think I'm gonna leave this where it's at, but that said, it's not going to be as good as it was before, and frankly, I don't think that its popularity is going to maintain through the end of the season, because nerfing the damage on a weapon that already wasn't super powerful is obviously going to make it a lot less appealing, even if it is very easy to use. So this is almost like the new Kilo 2.0 now, because the damage nerf, and because the Kilo is going to stay in competitive, they didn't touch it in this update. I feel like I pretty much have to leave this in there as well. Now, the FFAR got a nerf to its actual range, and then also its multipliers as well. And this previously wasn't super great. I was giving it the benefit of the doubt, leaving it in competitive. But I think with this newest nerf, it drops down to viable. Keep in mind the order here doesn't really matter. But it's got a really slow ADS. It's nowhere near what it once was, and considering now it's even less effective at a range and it's still slow for close range, it's still decent compared to, you know, the things in below average and some of the other options in viable, but I wouldn't say it's competitive anymore. Now, the Scar is in viable. This got bumped up to viable from below average after its most recent buff. But in this update yesterday, it actually got a nerf to the damage multiplier. I don't think that's going to kill this weapon, but you still don't really have a huge reason to use it. It is decent. You could if you wanted to, but it's not going to be the best choice. It stays inviable. Now, curiously enough, the next update was one that I was really excited to see. The Growl, my favorite all-time weapon in Warzone, actually got a buff to the physical damage. I think it was like increased by 2. So the TTK and the shots to kill on the Growl are going to be a lot better now. And it's already in competitive because it is so easy to use and it has such great velocity. It was one of the top choices for Modern Warfare weapons. And now because it is stronger, I feel like it stays. It's not strong enough to be top meta and be the #1 choice, but it is one of the better Modern Warfare options. I would say probably second best, just behind the AMAX here. So the Growl, definitely better. Still not absolutely insane like it once was, but the damage buff definitely makes it even more of a competitive weapon. Now the Groza got quite a few changes. It got a buff and a nerf. It got better recoil. They sort of smoothed that out, but it got a physical damage and a multiplier damage nerf. And frankly, I feel like it probably should drop down to viable, just because previously it was all right. It was in competitive back when we were using this as a more aggressive weapon. Same deal with the FFAR, and it wasn't really touched a ton in previous updates, so it didn't have a reason to leave competitive. But now it's got the damage nerfs. It's not going to be as effective as it was before, despite being easier to use because of the recoil. So I feel like viable is a more appropriate home for it after this last update. Now the Krig actually got a physical damage buff. It is already in competitive, and I think it's going to stay there, but now it is actually one of the better options. Previously, before this update, I made a whole video talking about like their top 10 best weapons. I didn't mention the Krig, and there were a lot of comments saying, Zach, where is the Krig? The Krig is good. It was overhyped as could be before this update. The damage was not great, but it got a physical damage buff. That's exactly what it needed to be a lot better, in my opinion, despite not being a huge buff. It's not going to make it broken or top meta, but it does make it one of the better Cold War options. Now, I think we'll see a lot more people starting to shift from things like the Pharah over to the Krig, because it's going to be a bit more versatile and a bit of a better option now because it's going to be slightly stronger. So definitely a solid buff to the Krig, but overall it was already in competitive. It's going to stay there for the time being. Now, the M13 did get a damage buff. It got a physical damage buff, something that a lot of people were asking for. I think it was only a 1 increase though, so it drops the shots to kill by like 1 or 2 depending on the range. I had it in viable just because this thing doesn't have a huge magazine for its fire rate, and its damage, even over range, really isn't all that great competitively speaking. So this is a tough choice for me again. I think it could be competitive. It's definitely borderline viable and competitive. We're going to give it the benefit of the doubt. We'll say it is competitive for the time being. Do I think it's going to stay there in the long term once they make some more buffs to other weapons? Probably not, but the M13 has had a lot of time out of the spotlight. They're finally going to buff it here to make it slightly better. Nothing too crazy yet again, but I would probably take the M13 over some of the other rifles like the AN94, the AK, the Odin, the QBZ for sure. So I feel like it's necessary. That it doesn't have to be in the same category as those. We'll bump it up to competitive, but it's definitely borderline. Now, surprisingly, the M4A1 got a slight nerf to its physical damage, which is kind of unfortunate because this weapon wasn't really anything too crazy. It's still easy to use, but it wasn't super heavy hitting before. And I feel like it actually does, unfortunately, drop down to viable after this update, just because now it's even less effective than it was before. And before, it was borderline competitive, I would say, just because its damage couldn't compete with a lot of the Cold War weapons. So, unfortunately, I do think that one drops down. Now, the Odin, for whatever reason, got a damage multiplier nerf. I'm not sure why the Odin was nerfed because it's not a popular weapon whatsoever, but it was viable before. I'll leave it in viable, but really it could be below average. It could be niche. Not many people are going out of their way to use the Odin because it's not practical. Its TTK is great, but its shots fires so slowly. The rate of fire is awful, and the magazine capacity is awful. So you don't have a reason to use it other than the damage. Maybe as like a sniper if you wanted to try that out, but I'll leave it in viable because frankly I feel bad, but it could be below average as well. It could be niche. You could sort of interchange that. Now the QBZ, oh, the QBZ. They've buffed it and they've buffed it and they've buffed it, and it's still not good, frankly. They buffed it in this update. It got a damage buff. It got a nerf to the speed, but it also, you know, is slightly better overall. It's going to be slightly stronger here. So is that going to be enough to make it competitive? Yeah, no. If you're a QBZ fan, I'm sorry, but I don't know what's going to save this weapon. It's got decent mobility, especially for a rifle, so it would be like that FFAR 2.0 in a sense, but it's just way too weak. I'll keep it in viable. But yeah, this buff, despite being something that it desperately needed with a damage buff, with a damage increase, it does not make it competitive whatsoever. Now, I'm not gonna lie, next nerf kind of bummed me out. The Ram 7 ended up getting a nerf to its physical damage. I thought it was pretty well balanced in all honesty, but I do think it's still competitive despite being slightly worse. The TTK is gonna be a bit worse, and so is the shots to kill, but it's not gonna bury it into the ground by any means. I definitely think it's better than viable. Probably in the top 3 options with the AMAX and with the Growl for modern warfare rifles. It, of course, is also a bit harder to use because of the recoil, but despite getting that damage nerf, I still think it's going to be one of those better options, especially for like sniper support and whatnot, so we'll leave it in competitive. Now, the XM4 is a tricky one because it got several nerfs, and the XM4 was feeling really good. They nerfed the physical damage, and then also the recoil. It's going to be tough to figure out whether or not this belongs in competitive because I'm going to leave it there for the time being because I still think this will be one of the better options for sniper support, and that's primarily why I'm leaving it here. But it's definitely on the verge of dropping down to viable if it were to receive another nerf in the future because honestly, it dropping down in terms of both recoil control, which really wasn't fantastic, and its actual damage is not helping its case just because it was not a favorite previously, although it was actually pretty strong and pretty competitive. This definitely does keep it in check a bit more, so it's potentially getting close to dropping down to viable, but for sniper support purposes, I'm going to leave it in competitive. Now, the good old M60 down here in below average ended up getting a buff to its damage and then also to its multiplier. Am I going to be using the M60 because of that now? Absolutely not. It's still below average. This is like a whole would not recommend you use these weapons category, and it's just way too slow and bulky and just not it. Even with the damage buff, I wouldn't go out of my way to use this. There are still many other better LMG options. Now, the MG34 was actually nerfed. They nerfed the physical damage in the multiplier. It was below average now. I don't think it's bad enough to drop down to garbage because the TTK is still going to be pretty insane on this thing, but awful reload speed. Awful mobility, and now the damage is slightly worse. It's definitely not going anywhere up, only down from here at this point, but we'll leave it in below average. Really no reason to use this LMG either. Now, the MG82 was in competitive. It got an ADS nerf in this update, and that was honestly kind of borderline viable and competitive as is, and I'm going to drop it down to viable now. Obviously, an ADS decrease is not the worst nerf in the world. It's still going to be just as strong as it was before and whatnot, but it did receive the damage nerf a little while back just after it was introduced, and pretty much same argument with the MG34 and M60. There are other better LMG options that I'd be using ahead of this, or instead of this, I should say. So MG82 will drop it down to viable. Now, surprisingly, the PKM got a nerf as well, but it also got a buff. They actually increased the damage, but they decreased the range. So I'm going to keep it in competitive. It's obviously not going to be as good at super long ranges now, but that damage increase makes a very powerful weapon even more powerful. The PKM's TTK over range was already phenomenal, so I'm really surprised they actually increased the damage here, but it definitely stays in competitive. I would probably have that as the best LMG right now. Now, the SA-87 also got a nerf for whatever reason. They nerfed the damage multiplier here. We're going to keep it in viable, as we've sort of figured out. You know, multiplier nerfs aren't the end of the world for a lot of weapons, and this thing still is going to hit like a truck. Its damage is actually insane. The shots to kill is actually very competitive, but it's sort of an awkward weapon to use. It's got pretty hefty recoil, comparatively speaking, and it's also kind of slow, so it's not the best LMG, definitely not the worst. It stays inviable. Now, the Stoner actually got a nerf to its physical damage and then also to its multiplier. I think this one is still probably in competitive. I haven't played around with this one too much, so it's possible it could drop down to viable, but in terms of Cold War LMGs, I do think it's still going to be the best option we've got, so we're going to leave it here in competitive, but that one is definitely one that could change in the future as we get more time with this thing and see how it competes against, for instance, the PKM or even like the Bruin, which was not touched, but is still one of the better LMG options. Now, this is an update that is probably one of the more drastic ones. The Swiss, previously competitive, is now easily top meta alongside the Kar 98K because the Swiss actually got an ADS animation update, so it's going to be a bit smoother, and they changed the optic to match the ZRG, which is super clean. It's just like the cross thread reticle now, basically, which I love. This update to me now actually makes me want to use the Swiss over the Kar in every situation. Before, I wasn't huge on the Swiss because I didn't really enjoy the optic all that much. Like, honestly, that is what was holding me back from using it. It's got really good damage, especially even compared to the Kar. It is better in a lot of ways. That optic, though, I wasn't a fan of. Now, though, it's actually super clean. I love it. It is easily top meta. These two, I think, are going to be the most popular weapons in the game by the end of Season 4 if we don't see other weapon tuning. The Kar already is one of the most popular weapons in the game, and now I think the Swiss is going to become even more popular, with the Kar potentially dropping down a bit more because, frankly, I don't think you have a reason to run the Kar over the Swiss anymore, besides maybe you like the slightly faster ADS or maybe you like the animation more. So the Swiss is definitely top meta, especially after this new update. Now, the AK-74U I had in competitive, it actually got a nerf and a buff. Its maximum damage was nerfed, but its minimum damage was buffed. Then it also got a velocity buff as well. So it sort of, again, balances out there. We're going to leave it in competitive. The headshot multiplier is pretty strong on this thing. It's very Bullfrog-esque in that sense. So we'll leave it here. It's a pretty solid SMG option right now, even with all the other good Cold War subs. Now, the Augs Buff actually went into play. It's sitting in viable based off this buff that was supposed to go live back at the start of Season 4. So nothing changes here, but just a heads up, the Aug Buff is actually now live. It's going to be slightly stronger. It got a buff to the damage, but it did get a nerf to the headshot multiplier. So yeah, it definitely stays inviolable. Now, the Bullfrog actually got a nerf to the damage and a multiplier buff, so it got a buff and a nerf yet again. I feel like because of that, it has to stay in competitive, but it's borderline viable, I will say, at this point, just because the damage is so good, only within like 12 to 14 meters. Outside of that, the Bullfrog is awful. I would honestly put the Bullfrog in below average or garbage. If it's up close TTK and its headshot TTK were not so good. But we'll leave it in competitive for now because of that previously stated close range ability to just absolutely dominate. Now, the poor KSP, it got a nerf to the damage multiplier, and while I've stated multiple times already that the multipliers are not the end of the world for weapons, it's not doing the KSP any favors by getting nerfed. This thing was not ideal before. I feel like being kind of generous leaving it inviolable. It's certainly below average now with it being even less strong compared to before. Would never really recommend using the KSP unless it got an insane damage buff in the coming days and weeks. Now, the LC10 we have in competitive, and this actually got a nerf to the physical damage and the multiplier, which is tough because the LC10 is a great hybrid weapon. So is the Milano. And I feel like just because we've seen all these other SMGs also get nerfed, and we have got quite a few to go as well, it's going to stay in competitive just because we're still going to be using all the same weapons as before pretty much here. They're all just going to be slightly less strong, right? That's a big thing with this update. A lot of the same weapons are going to be used, but they're not going to be nearly as good as before, so the LC10 will stay in competitive. Now, the MAC-10, man, I love this gun. It's so much fun to use, but they did actually nerf the physical damage on it, which is quite unfortunate, but same deal with the LC10. I'm going to leave this in competitive right now, especially for the mobility. This thing is so good as an aggressive sub, but it's definitely on the verge of dropping down to viable because the damage is now going to be a lot weaker, unfortunately. Now, the Milano also got several nerfs. They actually ended up nerfing the damage range, the recoil, and the multiplier. Basically, they don't want this thing to be used as an actual assault rifle anymore, which is what it was being used as with the 3x optic and whatnot. A pretty unfortunate nerf, in all honesty. It's going to really limit it. It's tough. This one, I would say, out of all the SMGs that we've talked about so far, is the closest to dropping down to viable. But I'm gonna leave it in competitive because it is so easy to use, and it still should be a decent hybrid weapon, especially for sniper support alongside the LC10 if you're just looking at SMGs. So it's a close one for sure because the Milano was pretty weak before it got the buff that made it the assault rifle SMG. So we'll keep it in competitive, but it's definitely a close one. Now, the Cold War Mp5 also got a nerf to its physical damage. It wasn't an insane nerf, but it is going to be slightly weaker. Again, though, it is going to stay in competitive as one of the best SMGs. Good mobility, really good close TTK up, I think around within 9 to 10 meters, depending on what attachments you're running, up to like 12 meters if you have all the range extending ones. So really good up close. It does fall off pretty heavy. It's close to becoming viable yet again because of these nerfs though. Now the nail gun, it's in niche. It's going to stay in niche regardless of what updates it ever gets really. But they did nerf the damage and the multiplier, so it's going to be slightly less effective than before. I have to sneeze. All right, sneeze out of the way. The Bison. Bison got a nerf and a buff. The max damage was nerfed. The minimum damage was buffed. It's going to stay in below average. It could potentially be argued for viable. Actually, we'll bump it up to viable because honestly, the more I look at the stat line here, it is actually relatively similar to some of the other SMGs, at least up close. Obviously over range, you're not using it anyway, so that's not a super strong argument. But it got a minimum damage buff. It's going to be slightly stronger in all ranges. Regardless, now it's just going to be slightly less effective when it comes to where you could be outputting the maximum damage. But compared to some other SMGs, it's not the worst choice. Now, the PPSH actually got a nerf to its physical damage. That's going to hurt it quite a bit. The TTK on this thing is really special because if you're missing shots, it's going to drop pretty severely. And I'm not going to lie, I think it might move down to viable because of that. It's definitely better than some of the other subs in viable, but this damage nerf, it's not a ton, but just because of how funky the PPSH's TTK already is, it makes it a bit more difficult to use, which is a bummer because I do think it's really underrated, but you gotta have a really, really good ability to stay on the chest and head for this gun to be that effective. So unfortunately, I think it does drop down to viable. Now, another surprising update was actually to the ISO, which I have in below average. I'm gonna bump it up to viable because it did actually get a physical damage buff. So it's going to be slightly stronger now, and it might actually become one of the more popular Modern Warfare SMGs because of that. It was not awful before, but it was mainly in below average because there were so many other better options in the SMG meta. But considering everything else got some nerfs, and this actually got a buff, it does make it a lot better than before in terms of, you know, comparing all the SMGs to one another. So it's going to be slightly better. Now, the Uzi did get a physical damage buff as well, but I'm going to keep it in below average because it is so limited by that 32 round mag for the AE rounds, which you pretty much have to run to make this a decent weapon. So unfortunately, that one stays in below average. Now, the Fennec is currently inviable. It got a nerf to its physical damage, which is quite unfortunate because it wasn't very strong before. That said, I would probably still take it over the ISO, so we're going to leave them in the same category because the Fennec is by no means competitive. It's way too weak at a range. Its velocity is pretty bad, but up close, like within that 9 or 10 meter range or so, it will fry. So we're gonna leave it inviable there. And then to close things out, we've got a few nerfs to the tac rifle damage multipliers for the AUG, the Carve, and the M16. The AUG, I believe I have down here in below average, and it's definitely gonna stay there. The M16, I still had it competitive, giving it the benefit of the doubt. We're gonna keep this inviable now. It's gonna drop down pretty significantly based off of this nerf, and then also the nerfs that it's received previously. That said, I would take the M16 over the AUG for sure. Also the Carve, I'm honestly going to drop down to below average just because it does not feel nearly as good as the M16, and I'd feel bad having them in the same category, almost putting them like close equals there. The Carve just feels awkward and its damage really isn't all that great. The M16 I would say is probably the best tac rifle in terms of burst weapons. The DMR though is probably now the best weapon in that category. So those were all the actual nerfs, but actually there is one weapon in specific that I want to focus on that because of everything else getting nerfed, it becomes a lot better, and I'm actually very glad about this update, and that is the MP7. Definitely now a competitive SMG. Maybe the second best Modern Warfare SMG. The Modern Warfare MP5, by the way, is now the best SMG in my opinion based off of all these nerfs because the Modern Warfare MP5 was not touched. So while we're still using the same setups as before and whatnot, and keep in mind we are going to be doing the best loadouts for after the update here in a few days once I get more comfortable using a lot of these weapons and really seeing what is capable of being in the top 10. All these weapons before, though, were a certain level of strength. Everything now is pretty much going to be dropped down except for the few buffs that we had here to certain weapons. But indirectly, things like the MP7 do become a lot better now. You could make a case for a few other weapons like the P90 maybe being a bit more appealing. Maybe something like the FAL being a bit more appealing. That was also nerfed, of course, though. But that TTK is really good if you have a good trigger finger. Overall, though, this meta is very interesting. We didn't see a ton of shifts here, but because that overall TTK shift, nothing's going to really feel as dominant as it was before. When it comes to what you want to use the best weapons currently, top meta, of course, for sniping, it's so funny that is like the best choices here. Car and Swiss, easily the best choices for ranged fights if you are a sniper. Anything in competitive you can use here on a certain class for sure. Things in viable, you could get away with using several of these, but especially the ones that were nerfed in here now that drop down into here, they're not going to be nearly as effective as before. And really what you want to be focusing on here is this competitive category, using things like the Krig with the MP5 or the Tundra with the Milano, so on and so forth. The competitive categories where you're going to find, I would say, the majority of the most popular weapons for the remainder of this season, but still, that's a pretty significant amount of weapons. This meta, like I said, though, very interesting just because we're going to have to get used to everything being so much slower to kill now, needing more shots to kill, having that longer TTK. It's going to be interesting how things play out in the coming days. That is going to wrap things up for this. These are now the best weapons to use after the update based off the nerfs so far. If you enjoyed the video or if you found it helpful, let me know by dropping a like on it. It would be seriously appreciated. And of course, if you're new here or if you haven't already subscribed, I am always covering everything going on in COD, so feel free to subscribe. That way you can always stay up to date. Once again, and as always, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I will catch you guys later. Peace out.